Hello my dear friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I am Joy and today in this lecture we will analyze the 50 years of bank nationalization in India. First of all, let us understand what is the current affair. The year 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of bank nationalization in India. So we will analyze the bank nationalization in India in this context. Now let us understand what was the background of bank nationalization in India. So basically nationalization means the government is taking over the ownership of the banks. So the first nationalization in India came up in the year 1969. So this was the first phase of bank nationalization, and the measure of bank nationalization came into effect on 19th of July 1969, and it was through an ordinance. So the government decided to nationalize private sector banks in the country through an ordinance, and the ordinance was called the Banking Companies Acquisition and Transfer of Undertakings Ordinance. And through this ordinance, the government actually transferred the ownership of 14 major commercial private sector banks. And this was 14 major banks in the private sector, and this accounted for around 70 to 80% of the total deposits in the country. So through this ordinance, government had nationalized 14 private sector banks in the phase 1 of nationalization, and this 14 banks which were nationalized by the government in the phase 1, that is in the year 1969, accounted for 70 to 80% of the total deposits in the country. And this ordinance, Banking Companies Acquisition and Transfer of Undertaking Ordinance, was soon followed by an act. So ordinance making power lies with the President of the country. So it is according to Article 123, President exercises this legislative power in order to promulgate ordinances, and ordinances are promulgated in the recess of the Parliament, and once Parliament meets, it has to be passed by the Parliament within 6 weeks. So the term of an ordinance is only limited to 6 months. So once Parliament assembles, it has to pass the ordinance within 6 weeks of its assembly. So this ordinance was replaced by an act in the same year. So the first phase of nationalization happened in the country in the year 1969. So what was the situation before 1969? Till 1969, that is till the first phase of nationalization, SBI or the State Bank of India was the only bank that was not privately owned, and the SBI was called Imperial Bank of India till 1955. So in 1955, SBI or the Imperial Bank of India was nationalized and it was called as State Bank of India. So during the first phase of nationalization, that is in 1969, SBI was the only bank that was under the government ownership. And now at present, there are 19 nationalized banks in India. Altogether, there are 19 nationalized banks in the country. Now, this is the background of the bank nationalization in the country. So, it was in the year 1969 that 14 major commercial banks were nationalized, and now in the year 2019, it marks the 50th anniversary of bank nationalization in the country. Now, coming to the reasons or the objectives behind the bank nationalization. So, we can divide the reasons or the objective into two. One is to encourage public trust, and second one for social factors or social reasons like welfare. So these are the two broad objectives of bank nationalization. So let us first understand the first one, that is public trust. So how nationalization helped in acquiring or gaining public trust by the government. So we will see that from the period 1947, that is when India got independence, till 1955. So during this period of 8 years, there were 361 private sector banks which failed across the country. So around 360 banks in a duration of 8 years failed in the country. That means on an average 40 banks failed every year in the country. So once a bank fails, what happens? The sufferers are the depositors of the bank. So depositors lose their money from all these banks which were shut down during this period. And this led to losing the confidence of the public in the banking system. So the public lost the confidence in the banking system, and this discouraged the public from saving their money in the banks. And you should remember that the period of 1969, it was only 20 years or 22 years after the independence. So the economy was not self-sufficient. We had various constraints in building up the economy. So financial constraints were one major constraint the economy faced. So one major source of raising finance for the economy was to mobilize the savings of the public. So it was necessary for the government to mobilize the savings from public in order to make investments in productive activities and in order to gain the economic growth momentum. But the public had no trust or confidence in the private sector banks because they were regularly facing financial losses and banks were frequently shut down. So what did government do? Government found out a solution in the form of nationalization. So through nationalization, banks' ownership will be transferred to the government. So people will have more trust and confidence in the government and therefore they will save their money with the government. This will help the government in mobilizing savings from the public and then government can invest in productive activities. So this was the first reason, and second reason was the social factors or the welfare factors. We have seen that all the banks except SBI was in the private sector. So this commercial banks which were under the private sector, they were catering to the needs of large industries or to the businesses. So they were in fact ignoring the agricultural sector in the Indian economy. If we look at the statistics, in the year 1950, only 2.3% of the bank loans were channeled to the farmers. And again in the year 1967, this 2.3% came down to 2.2%. So we see a serious neglect of the agricultural sector or the primary sector by the banks. And during those times, that is soon after the independence, a majority of Indian economy population was directly dependent on agriculture for their means of livelihood. So the industrial sector was not well developed, services sector was not well developed. So majority of the population were dependent on the agricultural sector and banks were reluctant to provide loans to the agricultural sector. They catered the interest of the large industries and the businesses which were the minority. And again it was estimated that around 70 to 80% of the total deposits of the country were handled or held by the 14 major commercial banks in the country which were in the private sector. So the motive of the state was that if this 14 most important or the major commercial banks, if nationalized, that is if they are brought under the government control and ownership, the priority sector, that is the agricultural sector, will have an easy access to finance and credit. And also the government had a focus of opening up the bank branches in rural and backward areas. So the private sector banks will be reluctant to open their branches in backward areas or in rural areas because their profitability will come down. There will not be much service utilization of these banks in the rural areas. So one intention of government was to increase the number of branches of these banks in rural areas and backward areas and majorly to include the priority sector which includes the agriculture, small industries, small traders, small entrepreneurs, etc. into the formal financial sector of the economy. So these were the major objectives of nationalization. Now let us also understand what were the consequences of bank nationalization in India. First of all, by analyzing the social factors or the welfare factors which was considered by the government in order to nationalize the banks, we will see that even though government had nationalized major banks in the economy, this did not help in eradicating poverty or eliminating inequality of income, wealth, etc. in the rural India and also in the country as a whole. Poverty and inequality continues to be a pressing problem in the country even now, even after 50 years of bank nationalization. And if we compare the performance of the nationalized banks with that of private sector banks, the nationalized banks are not better in performance than compared to the private sector banks in case of branch expansion or in case of increasing the quantum of deposits, etc. One major focus of the government through nationalization was to imbibe trust of the public and thereby increase the savings and deposits in the nationalized banks. So now if we take into account this 50 years after nationalization, when we compare private sector banks with that of nationalized banks, we see that the branch expansion of the private sector banks are better than nationalized banks, and also the deposits that are collected by the private sector banks are even better than the nationalized banks. And even the nationalized banks even created a priority sector lending criteria under which 40% of the total loans were dedicated to the priority sector, which includes agriculture, exports, housing, renewable energy, micro, small entrepreneurs, etc. So, even by creating a priority sector lending, we see that the benefit of this is taken by well-off farmers, because these are the farmers who has collateral. So, here also the government failed to meet its objective, and many of the loans had to be written off as bad debt, and which increased the NPA in the banks. If we analyze the statistics, we see that the public sector banks accounts for more percentage of NPA or the non-performing assets than the private sector banks. And this has affected the efficiency and profitability of the public sector banks or the banks which were nationalized. And also during the immediate phase of nationalization or soon after nationalization, there were increased bureaucratic interferences, political interventions. So all these led to decrease in efficiency, decrease in transparency, and also decrease in efficient governance and increase in red tapeism because of increased bureaucratic and political interference in the functioning of the banks. It had also led to overstaffing. During the initial years, all these were the consequences of nationalization of banks. So as a result of all these, the efficiency and profitability of these banks came down. And it was after the implementation of Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, we have seen there was a mass impact on opening up of bank accounts and financial inclusion. So we cannot say that nationalization has contributed immensely to financial inclusion as well. So these were all the consequences of the bank nationalization in India. But we must also appreciate the fact that immediately after the nationalization, the nationalized banks were able to mobilize a lot of savings which helped the country to undertake a lot of developmental activities, and it also helped in expansion of rural branches. It gave access to marginalized and vulnerable category. So these were all some of the benefits that were the immediate effects of nationalization. But in the long run, we see that after 50 years of nationalization, private sector banks perform better than the public sector banks or the nationalized banks. Now let us understand what are the key takeaways from this bank nationalization. Now, nationalization basically means government is taking over the ownership of the private sector banks. So this is a government interference. So even after 50 years of bank nationalization, in different forms we see government intervention in the public sector banks and in the nationalized banks. One such example is the mergers and consolidation of the banks. Another example is the recapitalization packages that the government provides for the public sector banks. Recently also government had announced a recapitalization package for 11 weak public sector banks which were under the prompt corrective action framework of the RBI. But rather than doing all this, government must focus on disinvestment and governance to improve the governance of the public sector banks in order to increase the efficiency of governance. And disinvestment essentially means selling the shares to the private sector. So government can think of both these options, and among this, primary focus must be given on governance to improve the governance structure of the public sector banks. You can find the PDF of this lecture on my Facebook page, and for any queries regarding your UPSC preparations, you can get in touch with me on my Facebook page, or you can email me at joyce.studyiq@gmail.com. Thank you.